You wouldn't take me when you could have. You watched me break, and you didn't touch me. She steps closer, no longer pleading, now offering. But you earned me. A breath. Hands lifted, not in surrender, but in choice. Now I belong to you. My body, my breath, my shame, no lies left. She kisses him. A slow, deliberate kiss. No desperation. Just decision. She offered herself to save her child. He said nothing. The metal shack rattled, a thin tin drum against the relentless assault of the acid rain. It wasn't a storm. It was the city breathing, its industrial lungs exhaling toxic mist into the perpetual night, a foul reminder of the world Dane Rourke had long since abandoned. He lived here, on the forgotten fringe of the port, a ghost among the corroded hulls and discarded dreams. Invisible, forgotten, just the way he liked it. The low, mournful sigh of distant cargo lifters was his only lullaby. The clatter of loose metal his only company. A sharp, insistent rap echoed through the thin walls, cutting through the drumming rain. Not the wind. Not a rat. A knock. B. Dane froze. His hand, scarred and calloused, instinctively drifted to the worn grip of the heavy-gauge pistol tucked beneath his cot. Unscheduled. Unheard of. No one came here. Not anymore. He moved with a predator's silent grace, each step a practiced displacement of air, until he stood before the reinforced door. His breath, steady and unhurried, plumed faintly in the cold, a visible testament to the frigid air that seeped even into his sealed sanctuary. He listened. Beyond the drumming rain, he heard the faint, ragged gasp of desperate lungs. He opened it. The narrow beam of his internal light sliced through the downpour, illuminating the figures huddled on his stoop. A woman. And a child. She was Solari, unmistakably so, even through the distorting sheet of rain that plastered her ink-black hair to her pale, blue-tinged skin. Her features, though gaunt, held a stark, angular beauty that even this misery could not fully obscure. Her clothes, dark and utilitarian, clung to her emaciated frame like a second skin, soaked through and gleaming, revealing the sharp angles of her collarbone, the delicate curve of her ribs beneath the thin fabric. She held a small, shivering bundle fiercely to her side, a child, no older than 6, its tiny face buried against her hip, emitting faint, desperate whimpers. The child's skin was a paler blue, almost translucent, its small form vibrating with cold. Her head lifted slowly, her eyes, wide and obsidian, locking onto his. There's no defiance, no aggression, only a profound, bone-deep terror that seemed to radiate from her like a physical heat, almost warming the biting air between them. Water streamed down her face, indistinguishable from tears, mingling with the grime of the city streets. She was a ruin, laid bare by desperation. Her voice, when it came, was a raw, fractured whisper, like a dying star trying to ignite. Please. The word was a gasp, torn from her throat. I'll warm your bed. She had sworn those words would never pass her lips again. Not after the camps, not after what the humans had done. But Kiri's lungs rattled against her ribs. Pride was a corpse she couldn't afford to bury. I'll clean your floors. Her voice hitched, trembling violently. The lie of docility, a fragile shield against the truth of her abject desperation. Every fiber of her being screamed to recoil, to vanish into the rain, to reclaim the last shred of dignity she had vowed to protect. The child's shallow, rattling breaths were a relentless hammer against her resolve. For her child, she would endure anything. This, she realized, was the final, most bitter price. I'll do anything, just let her live. Her gaze remained locked on his, a desperate raw plea for understanding, for mercy, for a transaction she already despised. Dane Rourke remained a statue, unmoving, unreadable. His gaze, flat and dark as a storm-battered sea, swept over them. He noted the way her pale skin was mottled with cold, the way her frame seemed to vibrate with exhaustion, every muscle taut with fear and despair. He noted the child's shallow, ragged breaths, the faint blue tinge to its small lips. He felt the cold seep in through the open doorway, saw the endless, oppressive night beyond them, the distant, pulsing red glow of a perimeter drone against the bruised clouds. There was no flicker of surprise, no hint of compassion, no judgment in his eyes, only a cold, assessing stillness. Pram. He said nothing. Kram. He simply stepped aside, the movement curt, almost imperceptible, a silent, unburdened invitation. Naira stumbled forward, a broken, desperate creature, clutching her daughter, pulling the child's small, shivering body into the sudden, relative warmth and stillness of the shack. Her legs felt like water, threatening to give way. A faint, choked sob escaped her, raw and involuntary. As she moved past him, the metallic tang of his solitude, of his history, filling her nostrils. Kiri, silent throughout, head still buried, clung to her mother like a burr, a small, trembling shadow. The heavy door swung shut behind them, sealing away the lashing rain, the oppressive city, and the outside world. No words were exchanged. Just the faint, metallic hiss of the lock engaging, a sound of grim finality in the sudden, heavy silence. The darkness was thick, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the roof, and the frantic, echoing beat of Naira's own heart. She was in, and the cost hadn't even begun. Days bled into a strange, disorienting rhythm within the metal shack. The relentless drumming of the acid rain became a constant backdrop, a reminder of the hostile world outside and the precariousness of their sanctuary. Naira moved through the small space like a ghost, her movements driven by a frantic, obsessive need to prove her worth, to justify their presence. She cleaned. She scrubbed the grime from the metal walls, polished the worn surfaces of the single table, swept the dust from the floor until her hands were raw and aching. She tried to cook with the meager rations Dane provided, bland, nutrient-paced and hard, preserved bread, attempting to make them palatable, to show her domestic utility. Dane Rourke was a silent, unmoving monolith in the dim light of the shack. He never touched her, barely looked at her. His gaze, when it did fall upon her, was flat, assessing, devoid of any warmth or demand. He would sit on his cot, cleaning his pistol, or staring at a data slate, his scarred face a mask, his presence a constant, heavy weight. He provided food, water, a cot for Kiri, and a thin, scratchy blanket for Naira in the corner. But he asked for nothing in return, and that, more than anything, began to unravel Naira. The lack of a price was a torment, a constant, gnawing uncertainty. She had offered everything, the last currency of her broken existence, and he had simply accepted their presence without taking. Was it a trap? Was he playing a cruel game, waiting for her to break, to beg, to offer more? Or worse, was she so utterly worthless, so devoid of value, that even her desperate offering held no appeal? The thought was a searing brand, twisting in her gut. She had been bought and sold, used and discarded in the camps. She understood transactions. This baffling indifference, this refusal to engage with her desperate plea, was alien, terrifying. Every morning she woke with a knot of dread in her stomach, half expecting him to appear with a grim face and an order to leave, to cast them out into the acid rain and the waiting drones. She imagined his voice, cold and final, telling her she was useless, that her offering was insufficient. The fear of being cast out, of facing the merciless city again, was a constant, gnawing presence, a cold hand squeezing her heart. She was a refugee, an outlaw. Her very existence was a death sentence. Her only value, she believed, was in what she could offer, and he had refused it all. One afternoon, as Dane sat polishing his pistol, Kiri, silent as always, crept to the small table. She had found a discarded piece of gray packing paper and a stub of charcoal. Her small fingers, surprisingly nimble, began to draw. She worked with intense focus, her brow furrowed in concentration. When she was finished, she walked to the wall nearest Dane's cot, and with a piece of scavenged tape, she carefully pinned her drawing to the metal. It was a crude, childlike rendering, a tall, dark figure with broad shoulders, standing next to a smaller, blue-skinned figure holding an even smaller blue-skinned figure. The tall figure had a faint, almost imperceptible line across its face, a scar. His eyes didn't flick away this time. He just stared at it for a beat longer, then returned to his pistol. He said nothing. The silence, Dane's silence, became a suffocating weight. Naira watched him, her own fear and confusion building into a desperate, unbearable pressure. She couldn't stand it anymore. She needed an answer, any answer, to this terrifying, baffling indifference. She broke. Her voice cracked the quiet like a blade through glass. It was not the desperate whisper of the first night, but a cry of pure, unadulterated frustration and despair. "Why won't you take what I offered?" she shrieked, her hands clenching into fists, trembling with the effort of holding back tears. "Why are we still here? Why aren't you asking for anything? What do you want from me? Why won't you just take it?" Dane Rourke stopped cleaning his pistol. His hand, steady as stone, lowered the weapon to his lap. He turned his head slowly, his gaze, flat and dark, finally meeting hers. There was no anger in his eyes, no surprise. Only that same unreadable stillness. He just said, "Because I said nothing." The words hung in the air, cold and stark, a blunt instrument that struck her with the force of a physical blow. She stared at him, her mind reeling, struggling to comprehend. Because he said nothing? It made no sense. It made all the sense. It was a truth that settled deep in her bones, chilling and profound. He had never agreed to the transaction. He had simply allowed them in. His silence is not an acceptance of her offer, but a refusal to acknowledge its premise. "It's true, Hai?" She didn't understand. Not fully. But the frantic, desperate need to offer, to prove her worth, to bargain for their lives, suddenly withered and died within her. The shame was still there, but it was different now, mixed with a bewildering, desolate clarity. She stopped offering. The knock came at midday, sharp and authoritative, cutting through the dull hum of the city like a scalpel. Not the hesitant rap of a refugee, but the confident, demanding pound of someone with authority. Dane Rourke was at his workbench, meticulously disassembling a scavenged comms unit, his scarred face illuminated by the flickering light of a bare bulb. His head didn't snap up. It simply tilted, a subtle shift in the air of the shack, acknowledging the intrusion. "Rourke, open up! Routine inspection!" The voice was a gravelly bark, laced with an unpleasant familiarity. "Commissioner Varenne." Dane moved with swift, silent efficiency. "Under the grates. Now." His voice was a low, flat command, devoid of urgency, yet carrying absolute weight. He didn't wait for Naira to question. He was already pulling back the heavy, rusted metal grates of the floor, revealing the dark, cramped space beneath. Naira, her heart leaping into her throat, grabbed Kiri. The child, silent and wide-eyed, clung to her mother's neck as Naira scrambled down into the cold, damp earth, pulling the grates back over them with a muffled clang. Darkness enveloped them, thick and absolute, broken only by the faint smell of damp earth and the frantic thumping of Naira's heart. She pressed Kiri close, covering the child's mouth with her hand, listening. The fear was a cold, suffocating blanket, pressing down on her, threatening to crush her. Every muscle in her body screamed with the urge to flee, to cry out, but she held Kiri tighter, her own terror a bitter taste in her mouth. Dane opened the door. Commissioner Varenne stood framed in the doorway, a hulking figure in the drab gray uniform of the city's enforcers. His face was a roadmap of cynical suspicion, his eyes, small and beady, constantly scanning, missing nothing. Two younger, equally grim-faced enforcers flanked him, their slug-throwers held loosely. "Varane," Dane greeted, his voice flat, devoid of warmth or surprise. His face remained a mask, his eyes unblinking, meeting Varane's suspicious gaze head-on. He leaned casually against the doorframe, a picture of bored indifference. Varane's gaze swept over the sparse interior of the shack, lingering for a moment on the freshly cleaned surfaces, then on the neatly stacked rations. "Still playing hermit, Rourke?" Heard some chatter about unusual activity in this sector, neighbors getting jumpy. His eyes narrowed, flicking to the corner where Naira and Kiri had been moments before. "Activity?" Dane raised an eyebrow, a flicker of cold amusement in his eyes, barely perceptible. "My comms unit had a minor pressure leak. Nothing for you to worry about." One of the younger enforcers stepped forward, his boots scuffing the ground. "Captain, there are fresh footprints here, smaller than his. And not human." He gestured vaguely towards the floor. Inside the grates, Naira's breath hitched. Kiri pressed her face into Naira's side, trembling. The air was thick with dust and the metallic tang of fear. Naira could feel Kiri's small heart hammering against her own, a frantic, shared rhythm of terror. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying to gods she no longer believed in. This was it. Discovery. Death. Varane's eyes narrowed, but he held the younger enforcer with a subtle hand gesture. "Is that so, Rourke? You got company." Dane's gaze hardened, his body language shifting almost imperceptibly. His hand tightened on his rifle, just enough for the worn metal to gleam faintly in the pale light. His voice dropped, colder than the deepest vacuum. "Back up. You're not cleared to search here." The burly soldier, emboldened by the commissioner's presence, took another step. "Cleared? We're enforcers. This is an illegal zone. We're cleared to search anywhere." Dane's eyes met his, and for a long, tense moment, the air crackled. The slug thrower, still held casually, seemed to grow heavier, more menacing. The soldier faltered, a flicker of unease crossing his face. Varane watched the silent exchange, a wry, tired smile playing on his lips. He stepped forward, placing a hand on his subordinate's shoulder, pulling him back with a firm, almost paternal grip. "That's enough, Miller." He turned back to Dane, his gaze sweeping over the shack once more. It landed on the wall, on the small, crude crayon drawing. His eyes lingered, a flicker of something unreadable, almost curious in their depths. "You been painting, Rourke?" Varane asked, his voice deceptively casual, but his eyes are sharp, probing. "You used to know how to follow orders, Rourke." Dane's gaze remained fixed on Varane's face, his expression unchanging. "I don't paint." His voice was a flat statement of fact, devoid of any inflection. He didn't blink. Varane's smile vanished. He stared at the drawing for another long moment, then at Dane, a silent history passing between them. He grunted, a sound of dissatisfaction. "Right. Well." He turned, gesturing to his men. "Let's go. Nothing to see here, for now." He paused at the door, his gaze sweeping over Dane, a knowing glint in his eyes. "I'll be back, Rourke, sooner than you think." The enforcers moved back into the acid rain. The heavy door swung shut with a dull thud, sealing away the sound of their retreating boots. Silence. Profound and absolute. Under the grates, Naira remained frozen, clutching Kiri, her body trembling uncontrollably. A silent sob burst from her, ugly and raw, tears streaming down her face, soaking Kiri's hair. She buried her face in the child's shoulder, unable to make a sound, the terror held at bay by the immediate threat, now overwhelming her. Above them, Dane Rourke remained seated on his cot, his pistol resting in his lap. He didn't move. He just sat, staring at the drawing, not seeing it. Only the space between the lines. The space he now shared. The silence after Varan's departure didn't fade. It thickened. Into dread. Into knowing. Naira moved like a woman condemned, her tasks no longer proof of worth, but acts of control. She knew they couldn't stay. Varan's gaze hadn't questioned. It had judged. They were already dead. She wouldn't let Dane be buried with them. Not a lot. She packed in silence. The doll. The cloth. Nothing worth saving, yet everything she had. Kiri watched, her obsidian eyes wide, mirroring her mother's worry with the unblinking honesty of children. Naira knelt, pulling Kiri close, her voice a soft, steady murmur against the child's hair. "It's time, little one. We're going on a trip." She didn't explain, didn't lie beyond the gentle euphemism. Kiri simply nodded, her small hand finding Naira's, squeezing tight. As Naira reached for the door, her hand hovering over the cold metal, a voice cut through the quiet. Dane Rourke stood by his cot, his pistol in hand, his gaze flat, unreadable. He hadn't moved from his spot, yet his presence filled the small space, a silent, immovable wall. "They'll catch you within 3 blocks. His voice was low, a flat statement of fact, devoid of emotion, yet carrying the undeniable weight of his experience, his knowledge of these streets, these hunters. It wasn't a question, or a warning, it was a cold, brutal truth. Naira turned, her body rigid, her gaze finally, truly meeting his. It was the first time she had looked him fully in the eye since that first night, since she had offered herself, and he had said nothing. Her own eyes, hardened by life, now held a fierce, desperate clarity. There was no shame in her gaze now, no plea, only a stark, unwavering challenge. "Then come." The words hung between them, bold and impossible. Dane didn't move, didn't blink. Naira's voice softened. "You've already made your choice once, let it be this one." He looked at the floor, at Kiri, at the door. His jaw tensed, his hand twitched, just once, like he might raise it to his chest, then stopped, a breath, slow, measured, then, finally, a single nod, sharp, final. He didn't speak, he just turned. His cloak shifted in the wind as he moved past her, past the girl, toward the back alley, weapon tucked beneath his coat. Naira looked down at her sleeping daughter, then she stepped out into the rain, and followed. Issy. They moved like ghosts through the labyrinthine alleys, a silent, desperate trio. Dane Rourke led, his steps measured and soundless, a shadow among shadows, his senses alive to every shift in the wind, every distant drone hum. Naira followed close, Kiri a small, warm weight in her arms, her head nestled against Naira's shoulder, finally asleep, oblivious to the silent, desperate flight. Her own breath was shallow, her heart hammering in time with her daughter's, a frantic drumbeat against the oppressive silence. Halle. They reached the extraction point. The ship waited, ramp lowered, its engines pulsing like a distant heartbeat. Rourke had paid someone off. It was now or never. "Peaties." Naira turned before boarding. She set Kiri down gently, carefully, against the cool metal of the container wall, as if shedding armor she no longer needed. The child stirred, whimpering faintly, then settled back into sleep. Kiri stirred, one hand on her doll, the other gripped a folded scrap of charcoal-stained paper. Naira straightened, her eyes finding Dane's in the dim, industrial light. She walked to him, alone. Not a mother. Not a refugee. A woman. "You wouldn't take me when you could have." Her voice was a low, raw murmur, stripped bare of all pretense. "You waited. You watched me break, and you didn't touch me." A beat of silence hung between them, heavy with unspoken history, with the weight of her humiliation and his baffling indifference. "But you earned me." Naira stepped closer, her gaze unwavering, her hands lifting, not in supplication, but in a gesture of profound, deliberate offering. And now I belong to you. All of me. My body, my breath, my shame, no lies left. Her voice dropped, quiet, reverent, imbued with a fierce, undeniable will. Take me. She kissed him, not frantic, not grateful. It was a slow, final surrender. Emotional, sensual, complete. Her lips, cool and soft, pressed against his, a quiet declaration in the harsh, indifferent night. It was the culmination of weeks of unspoken tension, of psychological warfare, of a bond forged in the crucible of desperation. Dane hesitated. For a fraction of a second, his body remained rigid, a statue carved from granite. Then, he answered, not with words, but with motion. His hands find her, resting lightly on her waist. Not possession. Recognition. A slow, almost reluctant acceptance. Oh, he kissed her back. Like a man thawing after a decade in the frozen void. His lips, cool and firm, responded with a depth that mirrored her own, a silent acknowledgement of the connection that had formed between them. They boarded. The heavy ramp hummed as it rose, sealing them inside the belly of the ship. The door hissed shut behind them with a final, resonant thud. The smuggler glanced at them. You two sure you want to go where the ship's headed? Rourke's voice, low and steady, cut through the hum. We're not running, we're done hiding. Not safety, not home, but no longer alone.